Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And our topic for tonight is War or Peace? Jeff Sachs knows what to do. That, of course, is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, of Columbia University. And he just gave some testimony to the United Nations. And I think the testimony was very important. So I'm going to play the video and do a running commentary on it, as I play it. And Steve says, hi, Doc, Israel agreed to a 4-day ceasefire according to WAPO. Thank you, Steve. I guess any ceasefire at this point, or any pause in the fighting at this point, is a good thing. Hopefully it will lead to further pauses. Hopefully the pressure will build up on them to do further pauses and further trades. And hopefully that'll happen very soon. If you'll give me a second here, I'm going to share this on Facebook. And now I will go to the video of Jeff Sachs, and we will hear a speech, which I will interrupt at various intervals to do some commentary. There we go.
我现在请萨克斯先生通报情况。
Mr. President, ambassadors, Secretary General, NDB President Rousseff, distinguished diplomats, ladies and gentlemen. Today's meeting takes place.
Okay, let me just sort of indicate there that he referred to Dilma Rousseff, who is the president of the new development bank. That's the BRICS Development Bank. And of course, he did that because he's going to be talking about the funding crisis in order to fund various projects so nations can recover from war. So that's who he was referring to there. Dilma Rousseff, the former Brazilian president, who now is the president of the new development bank, capitalized with $100 billion to fund projects. And there is Dee joining us. Hi, Dee. And hi, Kay. I'm
my wife has MS, multiple sclerosis. Very important to know.
Okay, I'm getting some sound from you, Dee. From somewhere. Something about multiple sclerosis. Okay, so we are going through Jeffrey Sachs's speech, to the United Nations concerning 4 wars and how to stop them. Jeffrey Sachs knows what to do, part of the title of today's show. So here I go again.
It's at a time of several major wars. In my testimony, I will refer to 4. The Ukraine War, which started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych.
So notice he refers to the starting date of the Ukraine War not as February of 2022, but 2014, with the overthrow, okay, of the Ukrainian government, duly elected government of Ukraine.
The Israel-Palestine War, which has flared repeatedly since 1967,
And again, he doesn't date the start of that war from October 7th. He dates it from 1967, because that war never ended. There was really no peace. There was only, okay, an occupation of parts of Palestine by the Israelis. And that occupation has been going on ever since. For 50 years, there has been no peace, just the occupation and the repression of the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Syrian War, which began in 2011, and the Sahel Wars, which began in 2012 in Mali and have now spread throughout the Sahel. These wars may seem intractable, but they are not. Indeed, I would suggest that all 4 wars could be ended quickly by agreement within the UN Security Council. One reason is that major wars must be fed from the outside, both with external finances and armaments. The UN Security Council could agree to choke off these awful wars by withholding external finance and armaments. This would require an agreement among the major powers. The other reason why these wars can end quickly is that they result from economic and political factors that can be addressed through diplomacy rather than through war. By addressing the underlying political and economic factors, the Security Council can establish conditions for peace and sustainable development. Let me consider each of the 4 wars in turn briefly. The war in Ukraine has 2 main political causes. The first is the attempt by NATO to expand to Ukraine despite the timely and repeated objections by Russia.
So note that he accepts that the fault of the Ukraine war was NATO's, because of the various things they did to push the Russians up against the wall from a security point of view.
Russia considers NATO presence in Ukraine as a significant threat to Russia's security.
And of course, it was a significant threat, okay, to their security. And I have to underline, how would we feel about that if there were a coup d'etat in Canada that was somehow brought about by China? Okay, and their new government wanted to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and to cooperate, okay, in a military defensive, so-called defensive alliance against us. That's the analogy.
The second political cause is the East-West ethnic division in Ukraine, partly along linguistic and partly along religious lines. Following the overthrow of President Yanukovych in 2014, ethnic Russian regions broke away from the post-coup government and appealed for protection and autonomy. The Minsk II agreement, endorsed by this council in Resolution 2202, called for regional autonomy to be incorporated in Ukraine's constitution.
Okay, so here, okay, I have to add that the Minsk agreements were fairly late in the game. We're talking the Minsk II agreement in something like 2019 here. But the war between the Russian provinces that were looking for autonomy, okay, within a federation inside of Ukraine, was being fought by the Ukrainian government for 5 years already, killing many thousands of people. And by 2022, that total had risen to 14,000 people. Okay, so the Ukrainian government was trying to repress the ethnic Russians for that period from 2014 to 2022.
But the agreement was never implemented by Ukraine, despite the UN Security Council backing.
I got to add some background to that as well, in case you don't have the background. That agreement, the Minsk II agreement, which provided for a federal arrangement, okay, with autonomy for the Russian-speaking areas, it was agreed to, it was signed by the Ukrainian government, it was guaranteed by the mediators who helped to bring about, okay, the agreement, the mediators being France, okay, and Germany. And then they never put pressure on Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement, which Russia was perfectly satisfied with, by the way. That has to be emphasized. Now, the news came out later, after the war in Ukraine started, that the guarantors of the agreement, specifically Francois Hollande of France, okay, and Angela Merkel, okay, of Germany, never intended to push as hard as they could to implement, okay, this agreement. That the purpose of the agreement was to give the NATO nations time to arm and train a very large army, okay, by Ukraine, so that army could continue to repress the Russians inside, okay, of Ukraine, and could eventually fight a war, okay, against Russia itself. When they were finished with the Ukrainian army by 2022, the army plus the reserves in Ukraine numbered 650,000 people. That was larger than any army in NATO. The largest army in NATO, excluding the United States, okay, is Turkey, and they have a 500,000 person army. So the NATO powers combined to help the Ukrainians build an army of 650,000, specifically to go after Russia.
The economic cause of the war results from the fact that Ukraine's economy faces both west to the European Union and east to Russia, Central Asia, and East Asia. When the EU tried to negotiate a free trade agreement with Ukraine, Russia expressed alarm that its own trade and investments in Ukraine would be undermined unless a three-way agreement was reached among the EU, Russia, and Ukraine to ensure that Ukrainian-Russian trade and investment would be sustained alongside EU-Ukrainian trade. This is a well-known event in trade negotiations. Unfortunately, the EU was apparently not prepared to negotiate with Russia over such a three-way arrangement, and the competing east-west orientation of Ukraine's economy was never resolved. This council could end the Ukraine war quickly by addressing its underlying political and economic causes.
Now, I had never heard about this disagreement over trade relations, okay, among the three parties. I've heard an awful lot, okay, about the Ukraine war and have been studying it very carefully. But Jeff Sachs brings up a very important economic factor that I had never heard about before.
On the political front, the P5 countries should agree to.
The P5 countries are the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. United States, the UK, France, Germany, okay, and China.
To extend a security guarantee to Ukraine while also agreeing that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, thereby addressing Russia's concerns over NATO enlargement. The Council should also work to achieve a lasting governance solution regarding Ukraine's ethnic divisions. On the economic side, there are 2 considerations, one in policy and the other in finance. On policy, Ukraine's strong economic interest is to join the European Union while also maintaining open trade and financial relations with Russia and the rest of Eurasia. Ukraine's trade policy should be inclusive rather than diversionary, allowing Ukraine to serve as a vibrant economic bridge across the east and west of Eurasia. On the financing side, Ukraine will need funding for reconstruction and for new physical infrastructure such as fast rail, renewable energy, 5G, and port modernization. As I described below, I recommend that the Security Council establish a new peace and development fund to help mobilize the financing to help Ukraine and other war zones to turn away from war towards recovery and long-term sustainable development. Consider in a similar way the war in Israel and Palestine. Here too, the war could be ended quickly by the Council enforcing the many UN Security Council resolutions made over several decades, calling for a return to the 1967 borders, an end of Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories, and the 2-state solution, including in UN Security Council's resolutions 242, 338, 1397, 1515, and 2334.
So he's calling for
Issues
bringing
uncertainty
back. Oops,
as to the future of Russia. His war
sorry about that.
The first is the attempt by NATO to expand to Ukraine.
So he called for bringing back the 2-state solution, okay, in the Middle East. Everybody's talking about that now. It's on the table again. It's on the table because Hamas brought it back. The Hamas attack underlined the failure, okay, of Israeli policy in trying to make the Palestinians, okay, a non-entity. They had been becoming very, very successful, very close to a normalization of their relations with Saudi Arabia, which would have put a big barrier in front of doing anything about, okay, a Palestinian state. The attack by Hamas brought up, made people face once again the need for doing justice for the Palestinians. Everybody sees that that is now a key to peace, because the Palestinians are not going to continue to take this lying down. So that, okay, was very important. Of course, the Israeli response is to highlight something very, very bad, and that is that the alternative to stopping the Palestinians from violent efforts to get justice, the alternative is to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide on the Palestinians. And so the nations of the world now have to face that. And in facing that, the nations of the world and the peoples of the world, okay, are deciding, God bless you, honey.
Thank you.
Okay, are deciding that they don't want to live with the genocide. God bless you. Okay, and they don't want to live with the ethnic cleansing, okay, of Gaza. Their populations don't want to live with that. And the populations are pressuring the governments and saying, no, We aren't going to tolerate this. That includes people here in the United States, a very large number of people here in the United States will not tolerate this kind of injustice. That's what's bringing the two-state solution back. Because people are voting with their feet in various ways and making it clear that they will not accept a solution to peace in the Middle East, which cuts the Palestinians out of the equation. And the only way to put them back into the equation is to give them a state, to create a Palestinian state, which is independent of the Israelis and of settler colonialism.
Despite the timely and repeated objections by Russia. Russia considers NATO presence in Ukraine as a significant threat to Russia's security. The second political cause is the East-West ethnic division in Ukraine, partly along linguistic and partly along religious lines. Following the overthrow of President Yanukovych in 2014, ethnic Russian regions broke away from the post-coup government and appealed for protection and autonomy. The Minsk II agreement, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202, called for regional autonomy to be incorporated in Ukraine's constitution, but the agreement was never implemented by Ukraine, despite the UN Security Council backing. The economic cause of the war results from the fact that Ukraine's economy faces both west to the European Union and east to Russia, Central Asia, and East Asia. When the EU tried to negotiate a free trade agreement with Ukraine, Russia expressed alarm that its own trade and investments in Ukraine would be undermined unless a three-way agreement was reached among the EU, Russia, and Ukraine to ensure that Ukrainian-Russian trade and investment would be sustained alongside EU-Ukrainian trade. This is a well-known event in trade negotiations. Unfortunately, the EU was apparently not prepared to negotiate with Russia over such a three-way arrangement, and the competing east-west orientation of Ukraine's economy was never resolved. This council could end the Ukraine war quickly by addressing its underlying political and economic causes. On the political front, the P5 countries should agree to extend a security guarantee to Ukraine while also agreeing that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, thereby addressing Russia's concerns over NATO enlargement. The Council should also work to achieve a lasting governance solution regarding Ukraine's ethnic divisions. On the economic side, there are two considerations, one in policy and the other in finance. On policy, Ukraine's strong economic interest is to join the European Union while also maintaining open trade and financial relations with Russia and the rest of Eurasia. Ukraine's trade policy should be inclusive rather than diversionary, allowing Ukraine to serve as a vibrant economic bridge across the east and west of Eurasia. On the financing side, Ukraine will need funding for reconstruction and for new physical infrastructure such as fast rail, renewable energy, 5G, and port modernization. As I described below, I recommend that the Security Council establish a new peace and development fund to help mobilize the financing to help Ukraine and other war zones to turn away from war towards recovery and long-term sustainable development. Consider in a similar way the war in Israel and Palestine. Here.
Okay, so I have to comment on that. I'm not sure how the Security Council could work, okay, its will. Oh, by the way, I mistakenly said before that one of the P5 nations was Germany. No, it's not Germany, of course, it's Russia. So somehow I forgot that Russia was one of the P5 nations. But that, okay, is relevant here because if the Security Council is to do anything itself when it comes to ending the war inside of Ukraine, it can't just start again from the situation in February of 2022 and try to negotiate from there. Since that time, the war itself has created a new situation on the ground. 4 of the oblasts, okay, of Ukraine have now been annexed, okay, by Russia as a result of its victories, okay, in the war. Okay, the 2 republics that had seceded from the Ukraine actually voted in a plebiscite to join Russia. They're now part, okay, of Russia. And also Zaporozhye, okay, and Kherson oblasts, okay, have also voted, okay, to become part, okay, of Russia. Now we can poo-poo the plebiscites as something that was somehow forced on them by the presence of the Russian armed forces, okay, in those oblasts. But there is every indication that the people in those oblasts want to remain, okay, in Russia. Furthermore, the Russians are currently not interested in a ceasefire. At least they're not interested in a ceasefire and a solution imposed from the outside. At this point, they are driving hard, okay, in the Kharkov region of Ukraine, and they seem to have plans to take, okay, the Kharkov region and then to drive south, okay, and make the city of Odessa once more a part, okay, of Russia. There is a possibility for the Russians to agree to the continued existence, okay, of Ukraine, but it would be a sharply constrained country. It might be the economic bridge between East and West that Jeffrey Sachs, okay, is envisioning here. But I don't think the Russians would agree to that Ukraine becoming a part of the EU. It certainly would insist on the neutrality, okay, of Ukraine. And in any peace agreement, it would certainly insist on the demilitarization, okay, of Ukraine. Now, it has almost accomplished the demilitarization of Ukraine by itself, okay, as of today. Okay, I think that the Ukraine military is on its last legs, and that is obvious to everyone who has been closely watching the situation there. But Russia had basically 3 objectives, okay, in Ukraine: the neutrality of Ukraine, the demilitarization of Ukraine, and the denazification, okay, of Ukraine. From where I sit, I think the Russians are very likely to continue to insist, okay, on the denazification, okay, of Ukraine. And I think Jeffrey Sachs was remiss in not actually mentioning that here. Maybe he wasn't remiss, though, okay, because, of course, when you advocate for international peace conferences and UN Security Council action, you don't go into every detail. So I won't say that he hasn't been considering that. I do like the idea of UN backing for anything that goes on in there. I think that would be important. And, okay, I do like the idea of the UN trying to use its internal means to get the Russians on board with a settlement that allows for the continuing existence of Ukraine. I think that's important for the future. Okay, and I would like to see that. But I don't see how Russia would ever accept, okay, a peace situation where it would have to disgorge the conquests it has made of areas which are predominantly ethnically Russian. I don't think that, okay, is ever going to happen. I think Russia would have been content with, okay, a Minsk agreement that gave these areas some measure, okay, of autonomy. It would have stuck to that agreement if it had been implemented. And those oblasts and Odessa and Kharkov too would have remained part of Ukraine. If Ukraine had agreed to make peace in March of 2022, if it had implemented Minsk in the first place, but then if it had agreed to the peace agreement that was ready to be signed by the parties in March of 2022, which was then torpedoed by Boris Johnson's visit. Even then, it would have been possible for Ukraine to keep all its territories, except, of course, for Crimea, which had long since gone over to Russia. But the Western powers, the collective West, is very stubborn about trying to push Ukraine into continuing to fight the Russians. And the result is this very constricted state, okay, of Ukraine. I don't think the Russians are going to accept anything less. I think the UN can try to negotiate it. But of course, the Russians have a veto power inside of the Security Council. Not only that, the Chinese have a veto power as well. So they're going to back them up. So I don't know that the P5 can come to agreement on what kind of peace agreement is going to come out of that. I think the most the UN can do is to maybe set up talks, okay, with the Russians to try to ease the path to peace. But certainly after the mobilization of so many Russian men and after so many Russian casualties in this war, and of course 10 times the casualties, okay, on the Ukrainian side, a lot of blood that's been spilled here for the Russians to accomplish that. And they're going to demand a security situation that they can trust, because they have no trust in the collective West, okay, at this point. I agree with Jeffrey Sachs, though, very much on the need for reconstruction, okay, of Ukraine, and the need for an international fund to help, okay, with that. Here we go.
The war could be ended quickly by the Council enforcing the many UN Security Council resolutions made over several decades, calling for a return to the 1967 borders, an end of Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories, and the two-state solution, including in UN Security Council's resolutions 242, 338, 1397, 1515, and 2334. It is clear that Israel and Palestine are unable to reach agreements in line with these UN Security Council resolutions. On both sides, hardliners repeatedly frustrate moderates who seek peace based on the two-state solution. It is high time, therefore, in my view, for the UN Security Council to enforce its decisions by implementing a just and lasting solution that is in the interests of both Israel and Palestine, rather than allowing hardliners on both sides to ignore the mandate of this council and thereby to threaten global peace. My recommendation to this council is that it immediately recognize the state of Palestine in a matter of days or weeks and welcome Palestine as a full member of the United Nations, with the capital in East Jerusalem and with sovereign control over the Islamic holy sites. The Council should establish a peacekeeping force drawn heavily from the neighboring Arab countries to help provide security in Palestine. Such an outcome is in the overwhelming will of the international community and the manifest interest of both Israel and Palestine, despite the vociferous objections by hardline rejectionists on both sides of the divide.
I have to say here, I don't think that the hardliners on the Palestinian side are going to reject that kind, of settlement. It seems to me Hamas, in spite of what its charter says, would at this point be very willing to accept that kind of situation. I think the PLO will accept that kind of situation if the United States, will allow it. I think the problem with the hardliners is not going to be mainly on the Arab side. I think it's going to be on the Israeli side. I think the Israelis have created a terrible problem for themselves by bringing in, the settlers, and by supporting the ideology of the settlers and the extreme religious tone of that particular sort, of ideology. Israel started out as a strange amalgam of the idea that it was to be a Jewish state, but also a secular and democratic state, and even in the early days, a socialist state. Now, that became really perverted over time in various ways, of course, but the primary way it became perverted was by letting in what I must characterize, I suppose this is inflammatory, but what I characterize as religious nuts. People who want to build, a third temple and have ritual sacrifices to prepare the site of the third temple. And they want to have the third temple where the Temple Mount of Islam is today, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is today. That is not something that can be tolerated by the rest of the world. And I'm afraid the Israeli right-wing characters who want that know it won't be tolerated by the rest of the world. They and the Christian Zionists who support them wanted that kind of solution to be imposed on the rest of the world by force of arms, including, if necessary, the use of atomic weapons. What I'm saying is, the solution being suggested by Jeffrey Sachs is one that I agree with, but it has to be recognized that the imposition of a police force from the Arab states to keep the peace is going to be vigorously opposed by those settlers, by the whole settler movement, both in Israel and in the Palestinian areas. Those settlers are going to will have to be moved. And they will have to be moved by force of arms. And Israel is going to have to accept that. And we need to know how that can be managed. That is, I think, the outline of a settlement. And I'm for that. But I think the devil is in the details.
An economic strategy should accompany the political strategy. Most importantly, the new sovereign state of Palestine must be economically viable. And I give several examples of how that can be done. But most importantly, both Israel and Palestine should become part of an integrated sustainable development plan for the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East that supports climate resilience and the region's transition to green energy. The Council could similarly end the war in Syria. The Syrian war broke out in 2011 when several...
I have to say one more thing about that. It seems clear to me that any kind of economic agreement which is designed to make the Palestinian state a viable economic state within the framework of an economic agreement that integrates the Israeli state here as well, which is what Jeff is after. That economic framework is going to have the participation of the Arab nations, most probably Iran, most probably even China, because they all have vital interests in the area, and most probably the United States. Everybody is going to have to agree on the vital economic framework for integrating the two Middle Eastern peoples who have basically been at war with each other since 1967. I think Jeff should have said something about how that might happen, but it's quite clear that this is going to require the cooperation of the United States and other regional powers. I didn't mention Turkey has to be involved. Egypt has to be involved. Also Lebanon, a whole host, Syria, a whole host of countries have to be involved in this economic framework, because it is, after all, the economic framework which is the framework for peace, the framework that can bring about a peace. And you can see that Jeff is thinking about it that way and setting it up that way. So he has a vision of this that he's proposing here. And it will take a lot more than just this 14-minute speech to get people to accept this particular vision. I think they should, because it is the way to peace. I go on.
Regional powers and the United States joined forces to topple the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This deeply misguided regime change operation failed, but it triggered a prolonged war with enormous bloodshed and destruction, including of ancient cultural heritage sites. The Council should make clear that all P5 countries and the countries in Syria's neighborhood are in full agreement that all regime change attempts are now permanently ended, and that the UN Security Council intends to work closely with the Syrian government on reconstruction and development. On the economic side, Syria's best hope is to become closely integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region, especially through the construction of physical infrastructure connecting Syria with Turkey, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean nations.
Okay, that's a great vision too. But what we have to mention here is that if that vision is to succeed, it is going to have to involve the United States as well. It's going to have to be with the consent of the United States, especially if we're running through the Security Council, on this. The United States has to be brought aboard. How could the United States be brought aboard? I don't think it can necessarily be brought aboard in the short run through this administration, through this group of people running governance here in the United States and running foreign policy. it might be possible to make this kind of settlement following the election of 2024. But what we're going to need, okay, is an election that at least produces, okay, an executive branch that will have someone like Jeffrey Sachs as the Secretary of State, okay, of the United States, implementing this kind of vision for Syria. This is a vision that Syria can agree to, and that the other powers in the Middle East can also agree to, and could all combine on. But if the United States is not in back of this vision, it will not succeed. We have to recognize much of the instability that we see in Syria today has been the fault of the United States and its foreign policies. These foreign policies have to change. Jeff Sachs would be ready to change them. But the question we have to ask is, who's going to make him the Secretary of State, okay, of the United States? Or even perhaps the President of the United States. He's obviously perfectly capable of being that, but he's not running for that. But at a minimum, we would need someone like him as the Secretary of State of the United States, someone looking for peace and willing to follow a collaborative foreign policy.
The war in the Sahel has similar roots. Just as the regional powers in the U.S. aimed to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad in 2011, the NATO powers similarly aimed to overthrow the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. In pursuing this aim, they grossly exceeded the mandate of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which had authorized the protection of Libya's civilian population, but certainly not authorized a NATO-led regime change. The violent overthrow of the Libyan government quickly spilled over to the impoverished countries of the Sahel. Poverty alone made these Sahelian countries highly vulnerable to the influx of armaments and militias. The result has been ongoing violence and multiple coups, gravely undermining the possibility of economic improvement. The countries of the Sahel form a natural aggregation for regional economic investment in infrastructure. The entire region urgently needs investments in electrification, digital access, water and sanitation, and road and rail transport, as well as in social services, notably education and healthcare. As the Sahel is among the poorest regions of the world, if not the poorest, the governments are utterly unable to finance the needed investments. Here too, and perhaps more than in any other region, the Sahel needs external funding to make the transition from war to peace and from extreme poverty to sustainable development. All P5 members, and indeed the whole world, have suffered adverse consequences from the continuation of these wars. All countries are paying a price in terms of financial burdens, economic instability, risks of terrorism, and risks of wider war. The Security Council is in a position to take decisive actions to end the wars precisely because it is clear that the interests of all UN Security Council members, and notably all of the P5 countries, is to bring these long-standing wars to an end before they escalate into even more dangerous conflicts. The Security Council is vested with considerable powers by the UN Charter when it has the resolve of its members. It can introduce peacekeepers and even armies if necessary. It can impose economic sanctions on countries that do not comply with UN Security Council resolutions. It can provide security guarantees to nations. It can make referrals to the International Criminal Court to stop war crimes. In short, the Council is certainly able to enforce its resolutions if it chooses to do so. For the sake of global peace, let the Council now choose to end these wars. The UN Security Council can also bolster its toolkit by engaging in economic peace building alongside the more usual decisions on borders, peacekeepers, sanctions, and the like. I've mentioned already several times the idea of creating a new peace and development fund that the UN Security Council could deploy to create positive dynamics for sustainable development and to work with other investors such as the World Bank, the IMF, the regional development banks such as the NDB, and others to co-invest in peacemaking. I would recommend 3 guideposts for such a fund. First, it would be funded by the major powers by transferring a part of their military outlays to global peacemaking. The U.S., for example, now spends roughly $1 trillion per year on the military, while China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia are the next biggest spenders, with combined military spending roughly half of the U.S. Suppose that these countries reduce military outlays by just 10% and redirect the savings to the Peace and Development Fund. That alone would free up around $160 billion per year. Second,
Okay. Jeffrey Sachs here makes the assumption that somehow the funds that can be allocated from the wealthy nations are somehow limited by what they now spend on the military. So you would have to take 10% away from the military in order to come up with $160 billion that he's talking about there. Well, I want to say 2 things. The first thing, I want to say is that I don't think $160 billion, is going to be enough to fund the peace in Ukraine, to fund the peace in Palestine, to fund the peace in Syria, and to fund the peace, in Sahel. Now, he may have costed all this out. I have not, but off the top of my head, I think it may take $100 billion just to fund peace, in the Ukraine. I also think, though, that there's no need. We may want to have the nations take 10% off their defense budgets. That would probably be good for the whole world. So that might be, a good thing for them to do. But the countries involved, the United States, Russia, also China, and some of the other countries too, are monetary sovereigns. The monetary sovereigns among them can fund many times the $160 billion that he's talking about here. The United States itself could fund the $160 billion all by itself and not even notice it. I think the Chinese can do the same. I think the Russians, if they're operating their economy as a monetary sovereign, which I believe they are these days, I think that they can also, just these 3 powers, can easily fund many times the $160 billion. I think Jeffrey Sachs would know that if he were, an MMT economist. He's not. So he has this idea that there's a pie of currency amounts that's being spent for defense that's sitting there, and that peace has to be funded out of that particular currency amount. That creates perhaps political difficulties in the various countries that are involved. Now, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe the countries would be willing to sacrifice 10% of their military budgets for the sake of peace. But if they're not willing to do that, I still would want to see the peace funded, and with a lot more than that $160 billion that I think is not going to be adequate.
The fund would emphasize regional integration. This is paramount for peacemaking as well as for successful development. Ukraine would be helped to integrate both West and East. Israel, Palestine, and Syria would all be helped to integrate in a network of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. The Sahel countries would be helped to break their isolation and lack of services through a network of infrastructure. Third, the Peace and Development Fund would partner with other funding streams such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, the European Union's Global Gateway, the G7's Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, and increased lending by the Bretton Woods institutions and the regional development banks, as the Secretary General has called for in the SDG stimulus. Interestingly, the Fund for Peace and Development could be a vehicle for greater investment partnerships that links China, the EU, the United States, and the G7.
So if you put all those funding sources together, then perhaps the objection that I made is not really relevant, because altogether there might be sufficient funds available to fund the peace in these various areas. It also has to be noted, however, that the Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions created in the post-war period, are not very good at funding development in areas that have to recover, because they are rigid when it comes to repayment terms, and furthermore, the interest rates they charge are interest rates that are unsustainable for the nations that they're supposedly helping. They have proved this time and time again with the developing nations. Now, the Chinese institutions have been better at offering long-term loans and working with other nations to help them and to help China trade as well, to do deals that are good for both sides. But I think the Bretton Woods institutions would have to change to make this vision of Jeff Sachs come true.
This too would be a contribution towards peace, not only into ending today's wars, but into increasing cooperation among the world's major powers. Directly across the street from us is Isaiah's wall, with the visionary words of the great Jewish prophet of the 8th century BCE. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It is time to honor Isaiah's words by ending these useless and destructive wars, slashing military outlays and turning the savings into new investments in education, healthcare, renewable energy, and social protection. As an American, I am proud that our greatest president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the visionary who oversaw the establishment of this great institution. I firmly believe in the capacity of the United Nations and of this Security Council to keep the peace and to promote sustainable development. When all 193 UN member states, or 194 with the membership of Palestine, live up to the UN Charter, we will have a new global age of peace and sustainable development. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that was a great speech and well worth, my breaking down. I hope the changes I wanted to see were clear. I hope it's clear to all of you that for the United States to be part of this and to help make it a success, somebody such as Jeffrey Sachs must have a primary role, preferably Secretary of State or President even, in our foreign policy. One question we ought to be asking ourselves: who of the candidates that are running for president now would be likely to appoint Jeffrey Sachs as the Secretary of State, okay, of the United States, even though I've suggested that he would make a very good president. Okay, and I believe that. Okay, I don't think he's running for president. And it's getting kind of late in the game for him to enter. But I think if appointed, if nominated, he would serve as Secretary of State. So the question we should be asking now is, who would be likely to appoint him as the Secretary of State of the United States among all the candidates we know of here? And this gets us to the next video, which won't take us very long. Well, I guess before I get to the next video, okay, I should say, I think the most likely candidate who is running, who has a decent chance, okay, to win, certainly if there is any kind of dump the corruption movement, but perhaps even if there's not, the only person who has a decent chance to win, who would appoint Jeffrey Sachs as Secretary of State, would be Robert Kennedy. And the reason why he might appoint him as Secretary of State is because both look to the vision of John Kennedy, okay, and Robert Kennedy when it comes to how you make peace, okay, in the world. They have that in common. Jeffrey Sachs is constantly citing the great speech of JFK, okay, at American University in the early 1960s, and talking about that as the basis for disarmament, for the disarmament that took place between the United States and the Soviet Union, that was begun in the Kennedy administration and eventually resulted in the disarmament treaties of the 1980s. So there is a line of contact between Robert F. Kennedy and the vision, okay, of Jeffrey Sachs. Of course, there is one big barrier to that right now. That big barrier is the ridiculous position that Robert F. Kennedy outlined for himself, his extreme position in supporting Israel, that he stated as late as his Declaration of Independence on October 9th, when he announced his candidacy, okay, as an independent. As I've said before in many of my other streams, he seems to be tied into certain financial interests that bind him more to the Israeli extremists than they do to the cause of justice, okay, in the Middle East, which Jeffrey Sachs is championing. So there's a problem. But if Robert F. Kennedy, in the face of the terrible events we've been seeing in Gaza since that time, can put aside that silly position which he embraced at that time, if he can put that aside, and he can be the candidate willing to change that he claims that he is, then that would undoubtedly boost his poll numbers very, very greatly in a very short time, and might result in deep changes in the strategy of the Democrats too for 2024. I don't know how Trump would be reacting to that, exactly. But I wanted to call your attention to, a recent poll. The poll was covered on Rising. It is a new Harvard Harris poll, and I just want to play a very short segment of this.
Now, Kennedy recently blasted government-implemented censorship, speaking
Okay, let me
candidate among the White House hopefuls, according to a new Harvard-Harris poll. He's at 47%, which is higher than Trump, who's just at 45%, DeSantis at 40%, Biden all the way down at 39%. Now, Kennedy recently blasted government-implemented censorship, speaking from his own experience. Here he is.
Now let's cover those figures in a little more detail. Okay. RFKJ had an approval rating of 47%, and he had a disapproval rating of 26%. Altogether, that, of course, is 73%. So 27% are undecided about him in terms of approval, and disapproval. But that's a plus 21 gap between approval, and disapproval. That is an overwhelming lead when it comes to the gap between approval, and disapproval. Now, second in approval was Trump at 45%, but he has a disapproval rating of 49%. That gap is -4. So when we're talking about the gap, there's 25 points between Trump and RFKJ. Now, somebody else Harvard Harris put into this poll, even though he's not announced any kind of candidacy for president, and I don't believe he's going to run for president, is Elon Musk. Why they put him in, God knows. But he had an approval rating in this poll of 44%. Okay, and a disapproval rating, did I get that right? Yeah, 44%, and a disapproval rating of 49%. There, the gap is -5. So it's a little greater, but comparable to Trump's gap. It's interesting that they both have the same level of disapproval at 49%. Wait a minute, I might have made a mistake in that. Let me see. I may have to play that again to make sure that I was correct about that. So let me share that once more. If I've still got the damn thing up here, well, even if I don't, I can easily put it back up. Okay, so I got that wrong. it evidently was the case that Musk was at 44 approval and disapproval of 35, which puts him at a +9 rating. So that is not as good, okay, as Bobby Kennedy's gap, but it's very strong performance, okay, in this poll. Then there's Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie doesn't give any indication of wanting to run again at this point. I think, and his support has really collapsed. His favorability rating is now at 41. His disapproval rating, his unfavorable rating, is at 41. So his gap is 0 between the two. That puts him in third place. Puts him in fourth place in this particular poll when it comes to the gap. Ron DeSantis is at 40 and 37. So he has a gap of +3. He stands higher in this poll, not in his favorability rating, but we have to note that 40 and 37 is 77. So 23% are undecided about Ron DeSantis. In Bernie's case, 82% are either approving or disapproving. So 18% are undecided in Bernie's case. In Elon Musk's case, he totals 79%. So 21% are undecided, okay, in his case. In Trump's case, 49 and 45 is 94%. Only 6% are undecided, okay, in his case. Bobby Kennedy, 73% are decided. So 27% are undecided, okay, in his case. So, okay, DeSantis then has room to go up. He may not go up, he may go down. But Trump is probably gone as high as he's going to get. He's probably ceilinged. Bobby Kennedy has room to grow with respect to favorability, as I think he would grow if he changed his foreign policy stance towards Israel and became the peace candidate. Once again, in Bernie's case, he's just not going to contest for it. I don't think Elon Musk is going to contest for it. But DeSantis has his hat in the ring already. And Trump and Biden and RFKJ all do as well. Now we get to Joe Biden. 39 approve and 53 disapprove. He is at -14. Trump is at -4. DeSantis is at +3. 53 and 39 means 92% are decided about Joe Biden. Not quite as much as Trump, where 94% are decided. But still, not much room for growth, okay, or improvement. In terms of the gap, Bobby's +21. Biden is -14. That's a gap of 35 points. 35 points. Let's say Bobby Kennedy changed his foreign policy stance towards Israel. He could pick up another 10 or 15 points. If he did it right. If he did it right. If he had a big event. If he repudiated Rabbi Shmuley and the Israeli extremists, he could get another 15 points up, I think. In that circumstance, we might get the victory of an independent in the run for the presidency, and we might get the appointment of Jeffrey Sachs as Secretary, of State. So that's my pitch for tonight. I know it's a little wild. But that's it. So, we have some comments. Steve Wolfbrand says, smash the like button. Steve Wolfbrand says, share this to your groups. Thank you, Steve. Robert Copeland says, the Temple Mount is a holy site for 3 different religions. So I don't see how they can come to agreement. I don't see how they can come to agreement either. So I think the Muslim holy sites have to remain Muslim holy sites, and the Israeli extremists have to give up their extreme view that they want to build another Jewish temple and that they want to have a greater Israel. Those things are not happening. Kay says, missed you all yesterday. Well, thank you, Kay. I think Dee had a show at 8 o'clock yesterday. Okay, I don't have shows.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, I had my show at 9 o'clock last night.
Yeah, at 9 o'clock last night. Right.
Yeah, Madeline and I won at 9.
Right. Okay, my shows are on Tuesday to Friday, and then I participate usually on Saturday in Dee's show, as well as participating on Tuesday through Friday on Dee's shows. So Robert Copeland says, the EU can fund a lot of the money, so it will be way more than 160 million, plus a lot more money can come from the other developed countries. Yeah, I agree, Robert. I agree. I think that's good. And Kay says, yes, Robert. And Steve says, I have to go to bed. Good night. Night, Steve. Sorry you had to go to bed. I wasn't really too late tonight, though. It's only an hour and 18 minutes. So, Dee, have you got any input on this?
I thought it was very good.
I'm sorry?
I thought it was very good what he said. Very interesting. But, like we all have to. I just feel like we're all in this waiting game right now.
Obviously, he's trying to break the waiting game by going to the United Nations and making an appeal for the United Nations to change and to become active and use the power that it potentially has to enforce a Middle Eastern peace.
Because a situation like this, for, I would say, 45 days, it's just uncalled for.
It's just awful. Okay, it's just a terrible tragedy. So he made an appeal to the United Nations to try to mobilize them to put a stop to it. But that can't happen without the United States. Now, he can get a vote inside of the Security Council with the United States vetoing and that being used as a pretext to go around the United States in the General Assembly. Maybe that's what he's aiming to do. If he was, he'd have the support of the Iranians on that, wouldn't he?
Oh, definitely.
He'd probably have the support of the Iranians for his whole proposal.
Yes, he would.
Yeah. And the support of the Chinese and the support of the Russians.
Yes. Because something like this should never happen again. Never again.
Never again means never again.
Exactly.
It should never happen. again. And it will happen again if the United Nations doesn't mobilize to stop it, to defend its own concept, okay, of international law. Then who will?
Exactly. That's why something has to be done now. Like he's trying to do something. And I think it's opened up a lot of eyes to the weakness of the UN where they're strapped. And it seems the US is the big strapper of things.
Yes. Yes. So again, it means the U.S. has to turn the corner in its foreign policy.
Yes, it does.
And we've been saying that for a long time. And the U.S. keeps clinging to this domination foreign policy, which is just a dead end. It just won't be accepted by the rest of the world. By the way, there was a setback in the last couple of days. The right-wing extremist Javier Milei won the presidency, okay, in Argentina. Okay, this idiot wants to dollarize the Argentinian, okay, economy.
I saw that. I was like,
He wants to throw the peso out, and he wants to make the dollar the currency, okay, of Argentina, and bind Argentina even more closely to its dollar debts. It has these huge dollar debts to the IMF, and I think also some to the World Bank. And it's suffering to pay these debts. And these debts are making it impossible for them to afford the development programs they need and the social programs they need. So this idiot is proposing to make the situation even worse by throwing the peso out of the window and binding Argentina even more closely to the dollar. Where the hell are they going to get the dollars to pay their debts? Is he going to go begging to the United States to give them a grant of dollars? I mean, this is idiocy. I mean,
who knows what's something's behind him doing this stuff. Because he's like you said, it's idiocy, but who's behind him?
and there are fascists behind him. He's supposedly a libertarian, but there are fascists behind him. He's going to develop a fascist regime. They're going to loot the nation of Argentina even further, make people poorer, and the whole thing will result in an extremist movement, okay, on the other side. And probably there's going to be a lot of slaughtering of Argentinians in the middle of the conflict. I think the situation there is dire. So we'll have to keep watch
Yes, we will.
on the development of that crisis. Okay, anything more you would like to say?
No, I think I'm okay.
Is it too late?
No, it's okay. Okay, so are we done for tonight?
It sounds like we're done for tonight. And buy Joe a coffee.
Oh yeah, buy me a coffee. Maybe contribute to my Patreon account and buy Dee a coffee also.
Yes, I love my coffee.
Okay, where can they buy you a coffee, Dee?
It's D Piers. Yeah, buy me a coffee, and then it's just D Piers.
Okay, is it D Piers without any hyphenations or periods or spaces?
Correct. Yes, just all one word. D Piers.
Okay, so it's /D Piers.
Yes.
Okay, so that's where you go. Okay, you go to buy me a coffee, and then it's
Yes.
/ and it's D Piers.
Yes, it is. Then I have a Cash App. Cash App is Dolores Piaz, Dolores. And
Yeah.
here's a Kay says, I used to have a Facebook friend from Argentina.
Who is the Facebook friend from Argentina? Okay, I think, okay, that Evelina is from Argentina, isn't she?
Maybe.
She knows a lot about Argentina anyway.
Yes, she does.
Yes. Okay, thanks, honey.
And please hit the like button, subscribe, and share. Share, and get
Yes.
more subscribers here.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Yes, good night, and see you tomorrow, right?
Yeah, Dee will have a great show tomorrow. Yeah, right, Evelina. Yeah.
Yeah, Evelina's been showing up at my show.
Yeah,
Quite
she
often.
has. She has, Kay. She's been showing up at around the world to Dee and Friends. Tomorrow night, Dee will have a show, and I will have a 9 p.m. Dump the Corruption show for sure. So thanks very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you. And also, I want to say, Kay, she's usually on Facebook for my shows.
Yeah, that's true. She is usually on Facebook. Okay, good night, folks.
Hey, good night, and good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
Okay, good night, Dee. Thanks for coming.